dive into the Bible.
Welcome to our segment where we take a deep dive into the Bible. The Bible is accessible to everyone, yet parts of it can be surprising and challenging to comprehend if we do not understand its cultural context. We always want people to understand that the Bible was written to a certain group of people in that time. It wasn't written to us, it was written to people in that time, and then we are able to glean truths from it because people are people, and people have not changed whatsoever. Now, some people flip out when you talk about the Bible being edited. Their problem is because that messes up their idea of biblical inspiration. However, God did inspire the Bible, but it helps me when I see that God inspired not only the writers of the Bible, but He also inspired the process of the Bible and how it was done. So it's clear when you study the Bible that some parts of it was edited, and I'm going to give you an example. Here is a passage that we see in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. It says, on July 31st, of my 30th year, while I was with the Judean exiles, besides the Kebar River in Babylon, the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God. This happened during the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. The Lord gave this message to Ezekiel, son of Buzi, a priest, beside the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians, and he felt the hand of the Lord take hold of him. As I looked, I saw a great storm coming from the north, driving before it a huge cloud that flashed with lightning and shone with brilliant light. There was fire inside the cloud, and in the middle of the fire glowed something like gleaming amber. Now, if you look at this, the first two verses use what we would call the first person I. I want you to get that, first two verses. And then, so as you're reading it, it looks like Ezekiel is writing. He says, I. Then when you get to the third verse, it switches to the third person. It says Ezekiel. Kind of weird, isn't it? And then you see the word him, and then it goes back to first person I. And I've highlighted and put squares there around different things. And so it seems really weird, and it almost seems like it's a case of someone writing under multiple personalities. I, and then Ezekiel, and then him, and then back to I. And it doesn't even seem to make sense. But all this simply means Ezekiel didn't have multiple personalities. It just simply means there was an editor of this passage. Now, I'm using the New Living Translation, the NLT, and it puts verse 3 in parentheses. But if you're using the New American Standard, the NIV, the King James Version, any of those other very good versions of the Bible, you're going to see that there's no parentheses there. And so in the NLT, the parentheses let you know that somebody's kind of putting a little commentary in there, a little editing in there. However, these other translations don't put the parentheses, and it just seems weird, okay? So here's the question that comes from this. Who can edit the Bible? Well, basically anyone God permits to do it. However, I don't mean to be, tart with that kind of answer. When we read these prophetic writings, we have a better understanding of who would do it. It was people of the prophetic class, served as the editors of the preaching and teaching of the prophets. Now, we see this prophetic class emerging during the time of Elijah and Elisha. The prophets lived together in an organized community. The group was known as the sons of the prophets. We see this in 2 Kings chapter 2, and even in 2 Kings chapter 4, it lets us know that some of these prophets were even married, all right? These communities began as early as the time of Samuel. We see that in 1 Samuel chapter 10. And during Elisha and Elisha's era, era, the prophetic community was large. It was very significant. Remember Obadiah? He hid at least 100 prophets from Ahab and Jezebel. You remember that? We have other passages where prophets were hidden or killed, and these would be what we would call prophets that lived in the community, and they were called the sons of the prophets. Was their main title. That's how the Bible calls them, and they would serve under a main prophet. There would be the main prophet, the prominent prophet who would do the teaching, and then they would be minor prophets who would work with them. And I'm not talking about minor prophets when we talk about prophets who wrote the smaller chapters of the Bible. I'm talking about just prophets that served under a lead prophet. And it seems like these main prophets would do the talking and speaking, and then these lesser prophets would do the editing and writing it down. We see this in Jeremiah 36 with Baruch. We see this with Elisha and Elijah. Elisha would be writing some of the things down that Elijah said. And then we just see that these unnamed prophets, that they would put this stuff in a scroll or a book without their name being mentioned is kind of impressive. Their name is not important. They're not trying to get any grandeur. They're just, God is using them in editing the process. Now, all of this would have happened, of course, under the Holy Spirit's guidance. That these prophets served in the Old Testament, served God this way with no recognition. It's really a lesson to us all. Now, we also see this in the New Testament. We see the same process. For instance, when we look at the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Mark is really Peter speaking. However, Mark wrote down what Peter said. And then when we look at Luke, for instance, Luke would have interviewed a whole bunch of people. He would also use the Gospels of Mark and Matthew to help him as reference books. And then Luke wrote it down as like a historian, or we could say, in a sense, he was editing the words of Jesus that he had gotten from all these stories from different people. Luke was a magnificent historian. And of course, he's the one that wrote the book of Acts. An incredible, incredible man. And so it's important for you to understand that God inspired the Bible this way to give us the information that he felt we needed to know. And so sometimes some people would speak and others would write it, what they spoke, and others, sometimes they would speak, and then God would have them come in and kind of edit it a little bit so it would make it more clear for other people. And yet God was behind it all, and we would still say it was God inspiring the Scriptures. I hope you've enjoyed this week's view of Deep Dive into the Bible, where we deal with the cultural context of the Bible.
Deep dive into the Bible.